Messerschmitt is the name synonymous with German aviation, particularly during the Second World War. In particular, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 is forever remembered as the Luftwaffe's main fighter during the Battle of Britain. During those pivotal weeks of the summer of 1940, Messerschmitts, Spitfires and Hurricanes wove intricate patterns in the sky, their vapor trails the only evidence of the deadly duels fought out by the pilots. There is no doubt that the Messerschmitt 109 was a worthy adversary, and it is a testament to its original design that it was still being developed right up until the collapse of the Nazi regime in 1945. Indeed, over 30,000 109s of various types were made, more than any other fighter, and it fought on all the fronts, from Europe, Russia to North Africa. But its designer, Willy Messerschmitt, was to create several other groundbreaking aircraft. For example, the Bf 110 was the world's first fighter specifically designed as a bomber escort. But probably his most enduring achievement was the Me-262, which was the world's first operational combat jet. This aircraft included features that are still found on combat jets in service today. Between 1935 and 1945, there was a great proliferation of aircraft that saw the full realization of the fighter's role, from First War scout to interceptor and tactical strike weapon. During the early 1930s, Germany led the way in the development of low-wing monoplanes. Up until that point, the fledgling Luftwaffe had been developing as an armed service away from public gaze. Its first aircraft were conservative designs, biplanes that were cheap to build. They were ideal for enabling the crews and manufacturing industries to hone their skills. Hermann Goering, a First World War ace, was the architect of the new Luftwaffe. He was a staunch supporter of Adolf Hitler, who in turn valued his links with the old Germany, the heroes of the Great War, who, in the Nazis' eyes, had been so betrayed by the armistice of 1919. It was Hermann Goering who encouraged the development of a new generation of monowing fighters, such as the 109. The project grew from a specification for a modern fighter with a retractable undercarriage and low-wing monoplane of cantilever construction. Willy Messerschmitt had enjoyed sporting success with his first monoplane design, designated the 108 Typhoon or Typhoon. The new design first flew in 1935, but a lack of a suitable German-built engine meant that the first examples were powered by, of all things, a Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. Later prototypes were to use the Junkers Jumo 210 engine. Development was rapid, and numerous records were established, which brought the 109 into the public spotlight. During the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, small numbers of B and C variants were used with some success. But it was the arrival of the Daimler-Benz 600 series engine that enabled the 109 to realize its potential. First of the new engined examples was the D, but it was the Mark E, generally known as the Emil, which was the first 109 to go into large-scale production. It was also the aircraft with which the Luftwaffe began the war in 1939. Its Daimler-Benz 601 engine produced 1,100 horsepower. This gave the new aircraft a top speed of 354 miles per hour at 12,000 feet and a service ceiling of 36,000 feet. Range was 412 miles at 16,000 feet. The 109E first appeared in 1938 and was the Luftwaffe's main fighter during the invasion of Poland, the Battle of Britain, and the campaigns in North Africa. Its armament consisted of 2 machine guns mounted in the engine cowling and 2 20mm cannon mounted in the wings. The fighter-bomber variant could carry either 4 50-kilo bombs or 1 250-kilo bomb, both standard bombs used by the Luftwaffe in 1939. Pilot survivability had also been considered, with the addition of self-sealing fuel tanks and armour plating around the cockpit area. But the 109 also had its drawbacks. The heavily framed canopy and narrow cockpit hindered visibility, which was a serious defect in fighters, and one which was not rectified until later in the war. The aircraft's other big drawback was its narrow track undercarriage, which retracted outwards into the wings. Although this feature made it easier to manufacture, it also made the 109 difficult to maneuver whilst taxiing, and some 5% of all 109s produced were destroyed in landing accidents. During the first months of the war, the German blitzkrieg swept across Europe. First Poland fell. Then, in the early summer of 1940, it was the turn of the Low Countries and France. The Luftwaffe had been conceived as a tactical air force, providing support and operating in unison with the ground forces. Also, the Germans were fighting much smaller and poorly equipped forces. But once they reached the English Channel at the beginning of June 1940, it became clear that the Luftwaffe was going to have to fight a very different kind of air war. The first problem was the lack of endurance. When providing bomber escort, it took time for the formations to assemble, using up fuel and thus limiting the amount of combat time available to the fighter pilots. But the main problem was that Britain's Royal Air Force also had modern fighters in the Hawker Hurricane, and especially the Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricanes were usually tasked with attacking the bombers, while the Spitfires went for the Messerschmitts. Throughout the war, both these extraordinary aircraft were constantly developed in the search for an advantage over the other. Sometimes it was the Spitfire that had the edge. Then it would be the Messerschmitt's turn. Both aircraft were fairly evenly matched in terms of speed and the tightness of their turning circles. But the Spitfire was lighter on its control than the Messerschmitt. This meant that in a high-speed fight, the Spitfire could pull out of dives later as well as take advantage of a better rate of roll. But the Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine used fuel injection, whereas the Spitfire's Rolls-Royce Merlin had carburetors. Thus, the Messerschmitt pilot could pull negative G-turns without the risk of his engine cutting out, unlike the Spitfire pilot. But the Luftwaffe had a huge advantage when it came to tactics, having gained the best part of 4 years' combat experience in Spain and the first months of the war. By flying in formations of 2 pairs, the German pilots had more flexibility in combat, as well as being able to provide mutual support in transit. The RAF, on the other hand, flew in formations of 3s known as VICs. Although the limitations of this formation were recognised, adding a sweeper to provide a lookout did little to solve the disadvantage. The task was usually assigned to the most junior and thus inexperienced pilots on the squadron, and his zigzagging across the sky only used up his fuel more quickly. With 2 aircraft so evenly matched, ultimate victory usually went to the better pilot, who had either the advantage of height or had seen his opponent first. In January 1941, units began receiving the first F variants, otherwise known as the Friedrich. It is indicative of how much the bias of the air war had shifted in the Allies' favour, in that whereas the 109E was conceived as an offensive fighter, the 109F was designed for the defensive role, with emphasis on rate of climb and service ceiling rather than speed and firepower. Thus, although the aircraft was powered by a 1200 horsepower Daimler-Benz engine capable of 373 miles per hour, its armament consisted of a single 15mm cannon and 2 machine guns. The most significant change came the following year, in 1942, when the more powerful Daimler-Benz 605 engine became available. The new 109 was redesignated as the G variant, or Gustav. But increased demands for additional equipment and greater firepower had a detrimental impact on the 109's flying characteristics. For example, pilots now had to land using full throttle, adding to the risk of accidents. Even experienced operational pilots described the Gustav's landing characteristics as malicious. Yet despite these problems, some 70% of all 109s produced during the war were Gustavs. Air combat had moved to higher altitudes, and so the new 109 was equipped with a pressurized cockpit. The G5 variant received the Daimler-Benz 605D engine, which not only had a larger supercharger, but also featured a water and methanol injection system. This system was to be used only in emergency and provided a further 425 horsepower over the 1,475 horsepower normally available.